Germany likes to think of itself as a country that was put back together. One flag, one border, the wall gone, and the past in museums. Then the Red Army arrived, and for 49 years whole districts of it belonged to a foreign power, sealed off and closed to the Germans living beside them. When the Soviets left, they left the cities behind. We found 10. Stay through to number 1, Jüterbog, where 40,000 Soviet soldiers were stationed against 15,000 locals, on a sealed training ground still rotting in the forest today. This story does not start with the Soviets. Almost none of these places do. The Germans built the barracks, laid the runways, and raised the parade grounds, and the Red Army simply moved into what was already there. Which is why the first place on the list was not built for an army at all. It was built for the world. Number 10. The Olympic village, Elstal. 20 miles west of Berlin, in a quiet birch wood off the road to Hamburg, there is a swimming hall with no roof, a dining hall built for the nations of the world, and a single restored bedroom where Jesse Owens once slept. The village was built between 1934 and 1936 for the Berlin Olympics, the games Hitler intended as a showcase for the new Germany. Werner March, who designed the Olympic Stadium, laid it out as 136 low dormitories around an artificial lake, with a gymnasium, a running track, and a dining hall of 40 separate kitchens, one for every national team. 5,000 male athletes lived here for 2 weeks in the summer of 1936. The women were housed in the city. The whole thing was built on army land, and it was always meant to go back to the army. So the moment the games ended, it did. The village became an infantry school and a military hospital. And the man who had overseen its construction, an officer named Wolfgang Fürstner, was dismissed from the Wehrmacht for being Jewish and took his own life days after the closing ceremony. Then, in 1945, the Red Army arrived and stayed for almost 50 years. Soviet families lived in the athletes' dormitories. Blocky concrete flats went up at the edges, murals went up on the walls, and at the back of the theatre they left a small painting of Lenin, still pointing the way. They left in 1992. What stands now is half museum, half ruin, the pool drained, the grand hall silent, and Owens's room preserved exactly as it was. An Olympic village is meant to be full. This one has been empty for longer than it was ever used. The Olympics at least left a name behind. Our next place is remembered for something far darker and far quieter. Number 9. Zeithain, Saxony. Between the small towns of Riesa and Groditz, in flat country near the Elbe, there is a grove of pines with an obelisk at its centre, and 4 cemeteries hidden in the trees. Zeithain began as a prisoner of war camp. The Wehrmacht built it in 1941, just before the invasion of the Soviet Union, and the first Soviet prisoners arrived that July to no accommodation at all. No barracks, no latrines, nothing but open ground. From February 1943, it became a reserve hospital for prisoners too sick or injured to work. It did not save many of them. Somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 Soviet prisoners died here, of hunger, cold and disease, along with hundreds of Italians, and they were buried without names in the fields around the camp. Then the war ended, and the same ground changed hands. The Red Army took the site, first as a transit camp for Soviets being sent home, and then as a base of its own. A tank regiment moved in. For the next 4.5 decades, the Soviet army trained on the land where its own men lay in unmarked graves. When they finally withdrew in the early 1990s, the base emptied like all the others. The barracks were left, the training ground fell quiet, and the memorial grove that a few local people had fought to preserve was all that anyone tended. Today there is a small museum, a documentation house, and the obelisk among the pines. Most of the men buried at Zeithain have no headstone and no recorded name. The forest has simply grown over them. Zeithain hid its dead in the trees. Our next place hid something else. 3 whole villages wiped off the map so that nobody would ever see it. Number 8. Hillersleben. In the Kolbitz Heath, north of Magdeburg, there is a barracks town in the woods with its own hospital, its own theatre and cinema, its own shops, and once its own newspaper and radio station. The village it was named after had 800 people. The base beside it held 30,000. The Germans built it first in 1935 as an artillery proving ground. To make room, they flattened whole villages and cleared a strip of land 30 kilometers long and 12 wide, an empty quarter where the newest and most dangerous guns could be fired without anyone watching. After the war, the Red Army took the range and made it the largest and most secret training ground it held anywhere outside the Soviet Union. The border with West Germany was only about 30 kilometers away, which made this a place the Soviets cared about a great deal and told the local Germans nothing about. Tanks, live fire, low-level flying, none of it was restricted, and none of it was explained. Behind the walls sat the 30,000 soldiers of a Soviet tank division. In a self-contained town, the villagers were never allowed to enter. They called it a Little Moscow, and it was one of several. The soldiers left in 1994. The Bundeswehr kept the training land for its own use, but the barracks town was simply switched off. For years it stood empty in the heath, the shops shuttered, the cinema dark. Then, in 2013, the whole barracks quarter was demolished to make way for a field of solar panels. A town for 30,000 gone, and a village of 800 still there beside the space where it stood. So far, these have been places built to be hidden. Our next one was built to be admired. Number 7. Krampnitz. On the road between Potsdam and the lakes, behind a long wall, there is a grand 1930s barracks with a mosaic ceiling, an officers' club, a theatre and a tennis court. All of it slowly falling in on itself. Krampnitz was built between 1935 and 1937 as a cavalry school, when the German army still kept the better part of 600,000 horses. The riding school moved up from Hanover, and the architect Robert Kisch designed something that was meant to impress, a model barracks for a modernizing army. Within a few years, the horses were giving way to armour, and Krampnitz became a school for tank crews and reconnaissance troops instead. The Germans abandoned it on the 26th of April 1945 as the Red Army closed on Berlin. The Soviets took it the very next day and did not leave for another 46 years. 6,000 soldiers and their families lived here, in a place so cinematic that after they were gone, the film crews moved in. Scenes for Enemy at the Gates, Valkyrie and Inglorious Bastards were all shot among the ruins. The Russians left in 1991. Then Krampnitz sat, too grand to knock down and too ruined to use, until developers finally arrived with plans for homes for 10,000 people. The plans stalled for years, held up, among other things, by a protected colony of rare bats that had moved into the empty buildings. If you are enjoying these, subscribe, because there is a version of this list for almost every country the Soviet army ever occupied, and we are working through all of them. The best of this one is still to come, and the next place was a whole town for tanks that the Germans have spent 15 years trying to erase. Number 6. Forst Zinna. Between Luckenwalde and Jüterbog, an hour south of Berlin, there is a panzer barracks being eaten by the forest. The roofs open to the sky, birch trees pushing up through the parade square. Forst Zinna has one of the uglier names in this story. Under the Nazis, it was the Adolf Hitler Lager, A camp built in the 1930s to train the drivers of tracked vehicles, which is to say the men who would crew the tanks. It grew fast, got its own railway station, and by the last weeks of the war was throwing half-formed divisions of teenagers and labourers into the path of the Red Army south of Berlin. The Soviets took it, and after a spell as a camp for displaced people, it became once again a place for soldiers. For decades, Forst Zinna was a Soviet garrison, part of the vast military sprawl around Jüterbog, until the withdrawal emptied it, along with everything else. And here the story turns, because unlike most of these places, somebody decided to undo Forst Zinna completely. In 2007, the order came to tear it down and give the land back to the forest. The demolition has been grinding on ever since. Yet the trucks have never quite finished, so a strange half-ruin remains, buildings gutted but standing, walls up but floors gone, a town caught between being knocked down and being left alone. Most abandoned places are simply forgotten. This one is being deliberately unmade, slowly, one wall at a time, and the forest is helping. Forst Zinna was a town for tanks. Our next place was a town for aircraft, and it is where the whole Soviet adventure in Germany came to an end. Number 5. Sperenberg. South of Berlin, deep in the forest, there is a 2.5-kilometre runway with grass growing through it, and a small passenger terminal, still bearing the date it was finished, slowly rotting behind the trees. Long before the airfield, this was where Wernher von Braun tested some of his earliest rockets, before that work moved to Peenemünde. The Red Army took the whole area in 1945, and in 1958, after some argument with the East Germans over who would pay, they built Sperenberg into their main logistics airfield in Germany. Everything came through here. The heavy transports flew in and out day and night, and a town grew up around them. 5,000 people with schools, a hospital, a cinema, and a train that ran, as so many of these did, all the way to Moscow. Then history used the place for its exit. In 1991, with an arrest warrant out for him, the last leader of East Germany, Erich Honecker, spent his final night on German soil at Sperenberg before a Soviet aircraft flew him out to Moscow, and from there to exile in Chile. The Soviets themselves held on until 1994. An Antonov transport was the last plane to lift off. After that, the gates were locked on 24 square kilometers of runway, hangars, and empty houses. For a while, Sperenberg was the favorite to become Berlin's grand new airport. The politicians chose the other site. So the last runway the Soviet army used in Germany sits in the woods, intact and unused, waiting for aircraft that were never going to come. If the list ended with abandoned runways and empty barracks, that would be one thing. The largest ghost of them all is still ahead. First, an army headquarters that sat for half a century on top of one of the darkest places in Germany. Number 4. Fürstenberg on the Havel. A small lake town, 75 miles north of Berlin, with grand villas along the water. For nearly 50 years, a third of it was a closed military zone, and most of the people living there were not German. After the war, the Red Army made Fürstenberg the headquarters of its Second Guards Tank Army, the formation that had been first into Berlin in 1945. It was a prestige posting. At its height, something like 25 to 30,000 Soviet soldiers were based in and around a town whose civilian population was barely 5,000. The lakeside villas were taken over for officers. A unit of Soviet Special Forces, the only one of its kind stationed outside the Soviet Union, was based nearby, trained to slip behind enemy lines and destroy missile sites. But Fürstenberg carries a heavier history than that. On its edge stood Ravensbrück, the concentration camp the Nazis built for women, where tens of thousands died. And when the war ended, the Red Army took part of that same ground for its own use and held it for the next 50 years. The full memorial to the women of Ravensbrück could only be completed after 1994, because until then, the Soviet army was still there. They left in the mid-1990s, and the Second Guards Tank Army went home to the Volga. The barracks emptied, the villas were quietly reclaimed, and a stone head of Lenin ended up in somebody's back garden. A town of 5,000 once held 6 times that number in uniform. Almost nothing marks it now. The next 2 are the giants. Number 3, Königsbrück. 30 kilometers north of Dresden, there is a wilderness of heath and low forest, threaded with old tank tracks and scattered with unexploded shells, and quietly patrolled by wolves. You are not allowed to walk most of it. Königsbrück was a training ground long before the Soviets. The German army laid it out in 1907, and every regime that followed used it in turn, but it was the Red Army that made it what it is now. After 1945, the Soviets took the Heath as one of their main training grounds in the south of the country, ran their tanks across it for decades, and, by several accounts, kept nuclear weapons somewhere in the trees. The town of Königsbrück, on the edge of it, filled up with Soviet soldiers and their families. Another closed garrison beside another German town that was told nothing. Then, in 1992, after years of local protest, the soldiers left. And Germany did something unusual with the ground. It decided to do nothing at all. There would be no demolition, no clearance, no rebuilding. The Heath was fenced off. The shells were left where they lay, and nature was told to get on with it. What happened next surprised even the people managing it. Within 20 years, the tank ranges had become one of the wildest places in Germany, a strict reserve of heath and rising forest where wolves walked back in on their own. Most of these Soviet towns were switched off. This one was handed to the wolves. The next place was the largest of its kind on the continent, and the Soviets hid it in a forest an hour north of Berlin. Number 2, Gross Dölln. 55 kilometers north of Berlin, deep in the Schorfheide forest, there is a runway so long you cannot see one end from the other, lined with hardened shelters, and, along much of its length, buried now under panels of dark glass. This was an airfield. In its day, it may well have been the largest military airfield in Europe. Remember those sealed-off districts from the start of the video? The parts of Germany closed to the Germans living beside them. This was one of the largest. A slice of an old imperial hunting forest that no local could enter, hidden so well that few of them knew what flew out of it. Gross Dölln was one of only 2 airfields the Soviets ever built new in Germany. They laid it out between 1952 and 1954. The other was Sperenberg, back at number 5. For 40 years the fighters came and went, MiGs and Sukhois, and a special unit kept nuclear bombs ready here for them to carry west, part of a short chain of bases meant to strike West Germany within hours. Twice a year, Aeroflot airliners flew in from Moscow, bringing the next intake of soldiers and their families. And in the 1980s, they reinforced the Great Runway for something stranger still. It was to be an emergency landing strip for the Soviet space shuttle, the Buran, the answer to the Americans that flew once and never again. The Russians took off for the last time in 1994. Then the giant went quiet. A racing circuit went in on the old apron. Then a power company covered the main runway, mile after mile of it, in solar panels. The largest airfield the Soviets ever built on German soil paved over and turned to power. For all its size, Gross Dölln was still only a base. The place at number 1 was something else, a garrison that did not sit beside a town so much as swallow it. Number 1, Jüterbog. An hour south of Berlin, there is a medieval market town with a Gothic church, and wrapped around it, in every direction, the ruins of an army. roofless barracks, an abandoned airfield, officers' houses with the ceilings down, and a nuclear-proof bunker sitting quietly in the woods. And beyond all of that, 20,000 hectares of sealed-off land, roughly the size of a small city, that ordinary Germans still cannot freely walk into. Jüterbog was a soldier's town for a very long time before the Soviets. The Prussian army bought land here around 1860 for gunnery practice, and it never stopped growing. Under the Nazis, it became the largest troop training centre in Germany, and 3 neighbouring villages were flattened to make room for it. Then, in 1945, the Red Army arrived, and Jüterbog became one of the most important Soviet bases in East Germany. And this is the number that stays with you. At its height, around 40,000 Soviet soldiers were stationed here, against a local population of about 15,000. The army was 4 times the size of the town. Tank divisions, an artillery brigade, and a fighter regiment flying MiGs in and out of the airfield from 1953 until the very end. The officers had money they could barely spend. One of them, a local historian remembered, wanted to blow his savings on drinks up the Berlin television tower and never got the chance. The order came in the end, as it did everywhere. Between 1992 and 1994, the Soviets packed up 49 years of occupation and went home, and one old resident said he had never believed he would live to see it. And then Jüterbog was simply left. The roofs came down. The floors gave way. A developer bought a chunk of it with grand plans. Demolition started on another, and much of the rest was handed back to nature. But it is so vast that the effort barely shows. You can walk for a long time here, past building after building with the sky coming through the roof, and saplings growing in the mess halls, and never reach the edge of it. This is the one from the start of the video. 40,000 soldiers against 15,000 locals on a training ground the size of a small country. Most of it is still sealed. Most of it is still rotting. The Prussians came, and the Nazis came, and the Soviets came, and every one of them left. The forest is the only army that stayed. 10 Soviet cities then, left behind in a country that was busy becoming one nation again. They were never really German towns, and never really Russian ones. They were something in between, dropped into the middle of Germany and sealed off from it. Whole worlds of schools and shops and swimming pools that the people living a mile away were forbidden to see. More than one of them was called a little Moscow. In a sense, they all were. 500,000 soldiers and their families living out an entire Soviet life on someone else's soil and then vanishing from it almost overnight. What they left is strangely consistent. The same empty barracks, the same fading murals, the same statue of Lenin, still pointing at a future that never arrived. Some of these places are being rebuilt into homes. Some are being bulldozed into forests. And some are simply being left to come apart on their own. There are more of them than the 10 we walked through today. There are always more. Subscribe, and we will go and find the next 10. Thank you.